Hi, I'm Steve Green. Welcome to another video. It's been a good couple of months or a few months, I believe, since I last posted to YouTube. So apologies for that. I had a bit of an illness a few months ago, and I've still been recovering. But this video is going to be covering a very, very simple auto number and also the auto registration of plugin steps. So we're going to create a very, very simple auto number plugin. There's probably far better third-party Codeplex and actual paid products on the market. So excuse me if it does seem very basic. I mean, we're just literally going to have a counter on a custom entity and a couple of fields to decide which entity we're going to target and which field within that entity we wish to update, and that acts as the counter. And then the latter part of the lesson, we're going to, when we create a record within this entity, have it auto-register a step. So it will create the necessary message processing steps in the solution for the particular entity we've just registered it against. So let's get going. This is my CRM 2015 on-premise on a virtual server on my machine. So it hasn't obviously got the latest navigation as per CRM Online Update 1. I believe that's not coming in till the CRM 2016, I think they're calling it, in the later part of this year. So for now, obviously you have to tolerate the fact if you're CRM Online, this will look a little bit dated now. This unpopular navigation, I think it was probably the driving force between updating it. But anyway, this is what we've got to work with. So at the moment, I haven't created any of the entities, so we're going to start by obviously creating a simple auto numbering or counter entity. So we'll obviously dive into settings, solutions. I've already created an empty solution file. So within there, let's bring that into view. Once that loads, so we can go to new and add a new entity. Also drag that into view. So this is the auto numbering entity, which will contain a counter for the current or the last number that was assigned. So we can call that something like auto number and then plural auto numbers. Probably make this visible in the settings area. Don't really need notes for it. Activities, connections, mail merge. You can always come back and tick these on at a later date. So then the primary field at the moment, it's called, this obviously defaults to name. We can give that this could be the actual entity name that we're going to target, because you'll typically, I would say, only have a single auto number per entity. There's nothing to stop you having multiple. This would usually be something like an account number, because accounts don't have an auto numbering built in. So if we call this entity name, update the name there as well. This will be business required. The maximum length of 100 should be sufficient to cover off most entity names within the system. Obviously, you can come back in and change this at a later date. So if we save that, it will create the entity. So that's now saved. So now we need a couple of extra fields. So as well as the target entity so for instance, account, we also need the field that we're going to target. Let's bring that into view. So field or attribute name, whatever you choose. Again, this would be business required, because there's pointless creating a auto number step or record if you don't know two things, which is the entity you're targeting and the field on the entity. So again, this is going to be a single line of text. The new field types is for 2015, whether it's a calculated column. It's just going to be simple text. Again, 100 should be sufficient. So So I'll leave it all as the default. So I'll save and new because we need to create more fields. So next is the actual counter, we'll call it. This is the actual an incremental whole number that will be added to every time an auto number is created. It will add 1 to this value. So we'll set this as whole number, minimum value, really. We're not going to start with negatives, I wouldn't imagine. Obviously, you're free to do whatever you like with your system. We'll leave it at the default maximum. If you're getting up into the 2 billion area, then you've got a pretty busy CRM, and I'm sure you're going to have a far more sophisticated solution than this auto number. Counter, obviously this is going to be a read-only. Well, it won't be read-only because only an administrator should be editing it. The counter, again, we should make it business required because the first time you set this up, you need to start an initial counter point. So you may already have records in the system and you want to start from, say, I don't know, if you've got 1,000 records, you might want to start at 1,001. So that's the reason for this counter, and obviously, we'll leave it not locked down on the form. So I'll save that. We could have additional fields depending on the format of your auto number. You might want to have a prefix field, so it's something that gets added, like, I don't know, ACC or something for account. Much like the quotes have QUO as default and cases have CAS. You could have a prefix field that you could concatenate in, and maybe even I suppose we'll create one just for the purposes of the demo. So if I save and new, so we could have a prefix field, which is going to be just, again, text. Doesn't necessarily have to allow 100 characters, but it's not going to impact the database because the data types are varchars anyway. So prefix not required, don't have to have one. And we could also have a suffix to go on the end of the auto number. These obviously are going to just be not hard coded, just entries on the entity. They're not going to dynamically be generated. I think I've seen solutions on the marketplace and in Codeplex that you can put formats in and random numbers can be generated in certain lengths and so on. So that's, as is going to be a very, very basic auto number, just to give you the idea of it. I'm not just going to spend hours and hours on this because it's not obviously a production solution. Yes, it could be used in production, but I'd advise you to spend a bit more time working on it. So again, suffix, single line of text. Maybe one other that you might want to do is something like a padding length for the... I'll call it padding length, which is basically, so rather than just having the prefix, say a hyphen, or part of the prefix having a hyphen, the number, and then the hyphen, the suffix, or just the suffix bolted on, you might want to make it that the number is padded to a certain length. So it might be, so if it was currently counter was at 1, you might want to make the length 5 and it would have 00001. So that's just something you could define so that it pads out that number, so it's always a fixed length. So when you're looking at them in views and on reports, they're all the equal length in the column. So whole number, I imagine you'll want to obviously have padding length, maybe starting at 1, which is obviously whether you include the actual value itself. Well, obviously you've got to include the value itself, because if it grows to double figures or triple figures, then this would be important, obviously minimum length. But if we just say 0 up to, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't want to think about padding it much more than 10 characters, again, because that's going to cover your 2 billion counter range. So padding length, again, not required. Or should we make it? Padding length, we'll leave padding length for requirement as optional, but in reality, I suppose if it's not present or there's a null value, we would obviously have to just add the auto numbers counter in. So it would just be at whatever value it is, and it wouldn't have any additional zeros padded on. So save and close that. So then we can design the actual form layout. So we'll take the main form, bring the designer up. So obviously by default, it's just got a couple of fields in a general section. So entity name, owner, we can probably make not visible because it's not really relevant. So display visible by default. Okay, I've got this zoom to 125% because my monitor's a 4K monitor, so I have it ever so slightly larger, which is why it looks quite dominant on this 1080 image. But also, if anybody's watching this on 1280 or a tablet or a phone, it should be fairly legible. So anyway, so the entity name, the field name we're going to target, the prefix, probably a good idea, the counter itself, the suffix, and then the padding length. I mean, we could make these formatted to their 1 column width, or this is a 2 column width section. Sorry, a 2 column section, and maybe stagger these across. But for now, I'll just have them down the form vertically. So if I save and publish, so now that's our auto number entity created. And if we go to our settings area, minimize that. So if I refresh, because it'll need to reload the sitemap, go to settings, scroll all the way to the end with the mouse wheel, and you've got auto numbers. Probably maybe you should rename that plural name to singular, just it doesn't read very well, auto numbers. But anyway, if I did a new, so brought up the new one, entity name, something like account, what's the field on there? So this would be, for the purposes of what we're going to do in the plugin shortly, we'll use the logical name because we'll be passing this in as part of the create message. And obviously if we're using late bound types, use the logical names rather than the schema names. So prefix, we'll do something like ACC hyphen. The counter, we'll start it at 0. Suffix, I don't know, we could put the hyphen in the current year. So you might want to update it every year and you know which year they were generated in. Could be part of this prefix, whatever. So padding length for now, we'll just say 5 characters. So if I save that, obviously there's no functionality behind this. It's just purely an entity, and we've just created a record within it. So if I go back to auto numbers, our very poor view design, just shows entity name and the created on. So we might want to add a couple of columns into the view. So counter, maybe the field name. Could add all of them in, to be honest. Suffix, padding length. There's not a lot of columns. So entity name could shrink down a little bit. Have the target field name, what the counter currently is. Actually, we'll do prefix for the counter, then the suffix, and then what the actual padding length is, whether we actually need that in that view. But save and close. I've got my solution still open, so I can then click on auto number and publish, which will publish that changed view. So that's published. Now if I go back to the auto numbers view, it should load with the new column. So you get a rough idea what it would look like in the entity. So it'd be ACC. Obviously this would be padded to 5. So 00000 hyphen 2015. So next we need to start on the plugin. So to create the plugin itself, I'll bring up Visual Studio. I'm going to be using the developer toolkit. Although it's developing for CRM 2015 and there isn't actually a developer toolkit for CRM 2015, there was talk about it, but it seems to have never appeared. And I don't know if there's some plans from Microsoft or whether they just abolished it. But anyway, you can still use the CRM 2013 developer toolkit, but there's a couple of gotchas with that as well, in that it's there's no installer for Visual Studio 2013. So there are a couple of articles on the internet. I think the Hosk's got one where he's got a walkthrough. I'll post the link below. And I think the Hosk's got the method of extracting the installer and putting the VSIX add-in for Visual Studio. And then once it's installed, you should have new project types. So I'll set up a brand new project. I'm going to, on the left-hand side under templates, Visual C#, there's this dynamic CRM. And under there's obviously obviously, it's not obvious if you've never seen it. There's the plugin library, workflow library package, and XAML workflow. This top template adds in a plugin library, workflow library package, and a Silverlight application. We're only going to be interested in the plugin library, but I'll use that one anyway, and we can obviously remove the other projects if necessary, or just remove the references so they don't get deployed. So I'll call my solution CRM. Well, I won't put a space because it messes up your namespace. So CRM 20. So yeah, just be careful of that when you're creating the solution. If you have a spaces in the name, it will attempt to put spaces in the namespace, which will obviously make a bit of a mess within Visual Studio. CRM 2015 demo or something. And then OK that, and it will ask me where my CRM instance is. You don't have to enter one at this point. Obviously, I'm going to because I want to connect to my local VM. So mine's just on a local host name. It's not secured. It's not IFD or anything. Hit connect. It looks a little bit corrupted on here because I've got this because I'm using a 4K monitor with the scaling set to 125% for the font. It ever slightly messes up some dialogues, so that's the reason for that. I'm not on a domain. The server is on a domain, but my PC isn't, so I can't use default credentials. Otherwise, you could just pass through your Windows credentials there. So I'll just type in my username and password. I'm hoping these keystrokes aren't too loud. I've got a new microphone, but it's on the desk at the moment. I need to get a boom arm, so it may be transferring these keystrokes very loudly, so apologies if it is. My keyboard isn't really that loud, it's just the mic's very sensitive. So when I log on, I can see my CRM demo organization, and then solution name. Obviously, we don't want to install it into or deploy into the default solution. We want to pick the CRM developers. Was empty. We've now got an autonumber entity within it. Could create another solution just for the plugin code and message processing steps, but for the purpose of this demo, I won't. OK that. It'll go about creating the package, adding the various solutions, prompts you for the Silverlight application whether you want to create a website to host it in. We're not interested in the Silverlight. I'm not interested in creating a website, so I'll untick that and OK. So then the default view that's coming up is the XAML Silverlight component. So and obviously you can see this CRM Explorer has popped up. If you don't see this CRM Explorer, at the moment mine's, if I auto hide it, that was auto hidden under View CRM Explorer. There is a bit of an issue, I think, with having this developer toolkit in 2013 as well. Sometimes when you reopen the solution, you'll get prompted that there's no organization specified, and then you have to go into your solution folder. There's a little SUO for solution options file. Delete it, reopen your solution. It'll prompt you for the connection again. It's a bit of a pain, but I prefer Visual Studio 2013 to 2012, and obviously it would be nice to move to 2015, but I'm not sure about the compatibility and if anyone's found a way of doing the same again for Visual Studio 2015, but I digress. So on the right-hand side now, if I just move the properties down a little bit, we can see the CRM package. It's got 3 references to the plugins project, the Silverlight application project, and the workflow project. Obviously, any JavaScript web resources would appear under that folder, and any other web resource types. And then this register file, which obviously tells it how to wear it, whether it's in the database, the isolation modes, and so on. But we won't cover that off. Well, we'll have a look at it in a bit, but it's not part of this demonstration. I've covered that off in earlier videos for previous versions of CRM. So then we can see a plugins project, which contains this base class and references to the CRM assemblies, but you can see there's a little exclamation mark. Not sure the reason why that is. I think it's probably to do with the fact that these are, because it's the CRM 2013 developer toolkit, the assembly versions would be version 6, and CRM 2015 organization we've connected to expects version 7. So we're going to replace these anyway. We can either do that manually from an extracted copy. Sorry, I'm just leaning my head to open a file browser. Let me just shrink this and bring it into view. So on my I've got the CRM SDK extracted, so it may pay to go and download the latest version. Obviously, there is a version now for CRM 2015 Update 1 with some new methods and stuff for doing sort of upserts type of, but we're not going to cover those because this is obviously an on-premise version, so it's not on that update version yet. But within there, you could browse into the SDK and bin folder and add the assemblies manually. I'm going to add it using a NuGet package. So if I right-click my root of my solution, you can probably just see that it's not cut off, I hope. It's got the manage NuGet packages for the solution. If I click on that, it loads this NuGet manager. So then expanded on the left is online and NuGet.org, and it brings up a load of NuGet packages from Microsoft and other third parties. I can type in CRM 2015 and it will go away and search online for any NuGet packages that contain anything to do with CRM 2015. What we're looking for is this core assemblies. And on the right gives you a bit of information about it. I believe version 7.1.1 will actually be the very latest versions for update 1, but it's backward compatible, so we can add those in. So simply click on install. It will ask you which projects you wish to add the references in. For now, I'm just going to update plugins because I'm going to remove this workflow project from this solution in a minute. So if I click on that, it'll ask you to accept the end user license agreement. I accept. You see a very quick dialogue, a little green tick, and then those references have been added to the solution. So I'm just going to close the Silverlight component and shrink down. So we saw the references have now been added, this XRM SDK. I'll scroll down. It's obviously the base version 7.0.0.0. If I attempt to build this now, so build solution, you will see this issue if you've used the NuGet package, where it doesn't understand what iOrganization service and that is, which is obviously strange because we've referenced those. The reason is that the NuGet package DLLs are built against .NET Framework 4.5.2. And if I look in the project plugins properties, the target framework for this solution is .NET Framework 4.5. So we'd need to increase that to the later 4.5.2. And then it's obviously giving me a warning about changing the framework can require a manual modification to project files. So if I say yes to that, it'll reload the solution in the new target framework. So now I can close that properties window, didn't mean to F5. Then build solution. So it's now built successfully, but if I check the output window, we can see that it's complaining that the assembly could not be resolved because it was built against 4.5.2, and this is higher than the currently targeted framework, .NET Framework version 4.5. So what we need to do to correct that is unload the solutions and edit the actual project files. So what I'm going to do is, for now, this is just to clean up the solution anyway, I'm going to remove this Silverlight application because I don't want it. Still on disk, but it's removed from this particular solution file. Likewise, the workflow I can remove from the solution. It's not deleted, it's just disassociated from the solution. So we could go back, add in an existing project and add that back in at a later date. So again, remove, yes. So next I need to unload the project file and unload the CRM package. saving the changes. And then we can edit it. We can see under here the target framework version. This line here is still 4.3, which is what that warning was telling us about when we changed the target framework, that we may need to edit the project files. So if we put a 0.2 in there and save it, close that one, plugins has already been done. So that was the reason, it was the incompatibility between the two. And then we can right click, reload project, right click, reload the plugins project. And then we should be able to obviously build successfully now. And the output's clean. So there's no error messages about the differences in the frameworks. So next we need to create a new plugin. So if I click on CRM Explorer and expand my entities, this will go away and query CRM directly. So it may take a few seconds or minutes if you've got a particularly slow connection or you're remote. So next we need to create the autonumber plugin. This is going to form part of obviously whether it's the latter end of this video or a part 2, which will be part of the auto registration that where we've created in CRM. I'll just jump back in. This record within the autonumber entity. What we'd like to happen is once we've written our autonumber plugin, is anytime a new record is created within here, CRM, well, our code, we're going to write a second plugin, will be registered against this autonumber on a create or even an update, well, both actually, and it will register our autonumber plugin against the selected entity. So whatever we type in here, it will go away and create the relevant message processing steps for the autonumber plugin to match the records that are specified within here. So hopefully that makes sense. So if I added another autonumber record called against the contact record with some sort of contact reference or something, we would have to manually register every time our auto-numbering plugin and remember to go and add a message processing step on the create of a contact. So for it to actually do the auto-numbering. But we're going to obviously create a plugin that will do that for us. It will register automatically our auto-number plugin. And likewise, if we went and deleted a row from here, it would deregister a message processing step. But for now, we need to actually create the auto-number plugin. So I'm just going to pick an entity from here because it's going to be a sort of generic plugin that's going to handle all entities. So I'm going to for now, we've got one registered on the account, but we can change this and this will be done and handled by our other plugin. So create plugin, it'll pop up a dialog. You move that into view. It's defaulted to because we're in the plugins project and we chose account. So these are kind of grayed out. And then we need to choose the message. So an auto number would typically only ever be run on a create. So a brand new record of the type, i.e. in this case account, is created, we would trigger our auto number plugin to go and increment the counter and add the reference into the record as it's created. So we're going to run it in the context. So create message in the context of the calling user, so the user that triggers it. We're not going to set it to a specific user. It'll just be whichever user's got the rights to be creating accounts. That's the context. Any manipulation we do will be in the context of that user that created the account. The pipeline stage we will set as pre-operation. So that's before the main database transaction occurs. Our plugin will, at stage 20, the pre-operation stage, will be called. We can then go off, read our auto number entities, counter and prefix and suffix, and then in the message, in the input parameters collection, where there's the actual target entity, we can add to the attributes collection the account number reference, and then it will get committed as it passes to the next pipeline stage, stage 30. The attribute would have been added, and then the new reference will become part of the new account that's created. So execution mode will have to be synchronous. You don't get the option if it's pre-operation. And then we need to give a name to this new class. Well, we're just going to call this autonumber or something like that, or autonumber plugin. I'll just call it autonumber. You don't get the option to filter on a create, obviously, because you're not triggering on changes of particular attributes. Everything that's part of the create message will be part of the filtering, the attributes that are submitted. So you can't filter. Execution order, we've only got a single plugin at the moment, so that's kind of irrelevant again. And then a description. So we could put autonumber plugin, doesn't really matter. And then obviously we can't do pre or post images. So if I register that, it will go and create a new plugin inheriting from the base class. So then what we see is this virtually empty plugin that inherits from the base class. It adds this registered event, and what this does is it gets triggered as the execute method is first called. This controls which message types and stages and entities the plugin is allowed to run against. So we're going to have to remove this portion of it because we want this to be quite generic. We want it to be at stage 20 and we want it to be on a create because it's an auto number. But if we hard code particular entities inside here, then although we write another plugin that's going to register the various message steps on other entities, so if we create, as per our example, the contact row, and we want it to auto-register, it would register it, but the plugin would never pass through into the execute auto number method because it would get stopped by these checks it does, these registered events, because it would be hard-coded to a specific entity or entities because you can have more than one of these registered events. So we need to blank that off and just pass in null. So then that should allow it to be any stage 20 pre-operation on any create message, and it doesn't matter what the entity type is. If I just delete that comma, we should see it's just expecting a string. But if we don't specify it, it opens that up to basically all. So then if we come down inside the execute auto number method, it's got a single parameter passed in, which is this local context, which comes from the base class. So we can see this local context gets passed in, where does it call the... Yeah, so it generates this local context here, which is essentially this service provider, and it contains various properties, an organization service type, plugin execution context, the tracing service, and so on, which we can then obviously use to call the standard message types and the updates and creates and so on, and do queries against such as the base class. So passes in this local context, obviously does a simple check that if that has failed for any reason to instantiate it, it throws an exception. And then we write our business logic beneath this to do. We can obviously delete that if we wish, but just gives you a little marker of where to start writing your code. So we need to begin by creating a late bound or instantiating a late bound entity type, which I can just set to null. Just initialize it with null. What I'll also do, although they're not particularly long-winded, the properties of this, so you've got local context dot, organization service, and plugin execution context, and so on. It's just a little bit long-winded to type those, even though you've got IntelliSense and autocomplete and stuff, but I'll just instantiate a local, create another shorthand version so I can just have my organization service and just point it to the same location in memory, the same organization service type, and then the plugin execution context, just give it a slightly shorter name. You don't have to do this step. If you're happy to just type out like that, when you want to call like updates and things, you could type all of that out each time, but I just find it easier just to say service. Just looks a little bit easier to read in your code, doesn't look so cluttered. So again, that's not a required step. So we've created a entity type here. The IntelliSense didn't look like it was coloured in, so I was wondering why the type wasn't recognised, but it is. So we've created this and instantiated it with null. We can then do a check on the context to make sure it contains, so my shorthand version now, the context dot input parameters, make sure it contains an object. Oops, can't type. So you can use contains or contains key, both will do the same. Does it contain an object called target, which will represent our entity being passed in? And is that context input parameter target, is it an entity? So if it is, both of those are true. So if it does contain an object called target and it is of type entity, then we can set our entity, entity late bound type equal to our input parameter target. Then we need to cast this because the return type is just going to be an object. So we need to cast that target object to the correct type, which is entity. So we can either say cast it at the start there in brackets, or do the as entity. Both will attempt to do the cast. The difference is that if this fails because the type was wrong, I mean, obviously we've done a check here, so we know it can't be. We know it has to be type entity, but should we be trying to cast something we obviously weren't 100% sure, and we attempted that, if the cast fails, it will pass, that will set that to null. It will just return null. Where the cast, where you do it in brackets like that, if that fails, you'll get an exception. But as we know in this instance that it is an entity because we've done the check in the if condition, we're confident that this will obviously cast correctly. It has to cast correctly. So, and then we can do an else. So if it doesn't contain target and it isn't of type entity, then we'll just return from the plugin, just exit, because it's pointless to continue because we can't do what we need to do. So something's gone a bit wrong, or this is registered incorrectly. So next, we need to go away and query our autonumber entity to see where it matches the entity that's been passed in. So because this plugin is going to be used on any entity type where the autonumber needs to be registered, we're going to keep it generic, that we need to go and obviously check that the entity this has been registered against, does it actually have a record in the autonumber entity? So does it have a record in here? And also we need to retrieve that and find out which field name we're going to target and update, and also the current state of this suffix, prefix, and counter. So we need to set up a query expression to query the autonumber entity to look for the current entity type. So this entity that we've extracted from the target object, its logical name, the entity logical name, we need to query autonumber for a matching record. And obviously there could be one or more, because if you've targeted to autonumber multiple fields with, so we need to do all of those. So in order to be able to use query expressions, we need to add a namespace. So I need to add a using microsoft.xrm.sdk.query. and that will allow us to instantiate query expressions. So query expression, just call it query. This is an overloaded constructor, so we can specify the entity name when we instantiate it, which we'll do. So that's now, we need the name of our new autonumber entity. So if I click on it tells us there as well in the components, but if I look in my solution file, my prefix is STEG. Yours will obviously be whatever yours is, and then auto number. So that's what we need to specify, is the logical name of your auto numbering entity. So then we could set a number of, as well as we can initialize the query expression as well. So there's various, so which columns do we wish to retrieve, the criterias, so on, any record ordering, and if you wanted to retrieve it in pages, if you had thousands of records, depending on how you wish to handle it. But in this instance, column set, we'll just specify, I'm just going to say true. It's not, column set true. That's not the most efficient way to retrieve entities, because obviously that will retrieve every single field on the auto number entity, which, although there's only a few, if I'm looking here under fields, we've only created a few custom fields. There are obviously also, there's 5 custom fields, but if I look at all, there's 24 fields in total. Well, by saying column set true, that's going to be returning all 24 columns, which isn't a very efficient way to query the web service. Ideally, we should specify as a string array the columns we actually want. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm not going to do that. But in production, really, you should be far more selective on what you return, so that you only return what you need. Although this is quite a simple query, and it's still fast to return. If it was a large result set, so if there's a lot of these auto number records, it could start to impact on performance. I suppose it's just not a very intelligent way to code, to just pull back everything. It's a bit brute force. So anyway, so the column set is going to return all columns. Criteria, we're going to set up a new filter expression. What that'll allow us to do is add a criteria to this query for just the entity type that's been, so the entity logical name we can put as a criteria, so that we only get, so if this was, for example, running on the account create, then it would go and query the auto number entity for account auto number records, and then we can see if there are any present. If not, we can exit the plugin. So the criteria, just set up a new filter expression. Then we can now start to, obviously we can add that criteria in. So criteria.addCondition, a new condition expression. Obviously that's got a overloaded constructor again with various, so we're looking for this one where we're going to specify the attribute name, and then the condition operator, and then the value. So the attribute name, if we dive back into here, will be this entity name. So we're looking to basically filter it and only return where the entity name matches the entity logical name here. So STEG underscore entity name, comma, the condition operator. So there's a enum with these contained within. So equals, and then the value will be entity.logical name. So, and obviously if we're registering this plugin Automatic with our other plugin on other entities, that will automatically pass in the correct entity logical name. So we should only return those auto number records. So that's our query specified. So query auto number, return all columns where the entity name matches the logical name of the current entity. And then we need to actually create an entity collection for the results. So just call it something like results, whatever you like. And then we can use my shorthand service .retrieve multiple. That takes a single property, which is the query. Anything that inherits from query base, which a query expression does. So I can pass in my query. So that will have gone off and retrieved, if there are any records, that is. We then need to do a check on the results to make sure that there's at least one or more, or at least one rather. So if there's not one, if there's no auto numbers configured, then although there's an issue that this plugin should no longer be registered against that particular entity, at least it's not going to continue and waste more processing time, and obviously fail if it tried to manipulate anything. So we can do if results. It's an entities collection, so it's got an entities type, which is this collection of the individual entities returned. So if entities dot, what I'm going to do as well, because I was going to use the link extension expression any, but obviously there's no IntelliSense at the moment on that, it doesn't understand it, so I need to go up here and just to keep it nice and neat, I can add system.link, which then gives me access to the link extension method. So any just returns a bool, so if there's, it'll be true or false based on whether there's any entities, so we know that that's obviously one or more. So if any, then we can actually process the plugin will continue and actually do the logic where it commits the new reference for the entity or references if there's more than one auto number. Otherwise, we can just have it return. I mean, if this is the only, all the logic's going to be within inside this if, this isn't really necessary because it will just fall out of scope of the plugin anyway and return and go on to the next plugin in the message in that stage. So if there's any results, then we need to iterate over these results and add in the relevant auto number expression into the relevant field that's targeted on the result. So now we need to iterate over. So for each entity E in results.entities collection, now we need to obviously construct our reference. So it'll be based upon the prefix, the counter with the padding, and the suffix. So we could instantiate those and create variables in memory. So prefix. Actually, I'll do all of them. Prefix, counter, suffix. Actually, sorry, counter's not a string. Okay, so now we need to create variables to store our various components in. So we can create a string for the prefix. I could do this comma separated, but so string for the suffix. Our counter is an integer, whole number, but the padded version will obviously have to create another string variable to store that. I mean, you don't have to store these, you could do them on the fly, but it just obviously going to look a little bit cleaner if we can see them declared individually. So counter and then an integer for the padding, and then possibly one more string, well, two more strings, which will be the counter padded or something, and a string for the final reference, so full reference or something. Okay, so we've got our 6 variables there, 6 variables. We now need to read the values or check if the entity actually contains those variables and if those attributes rather. If it does, we can set them into the various properties. So what I'll do is if e.attribute.contain, so we can check whether it contains, so stg, so does it contain the prefix field? If it does, prefix equals e with the square brackets and then the property name, attribute name, and then obviously we need to cast this because that return type is going to be an object, so we need to cast it as a string. And then repeat, let me just make some space, repeat this for each of the properties above. So if it contains suffix, we can set the suffix to equal that. And then if it contains counter, obviously the cast now will be different. So if I try and do that, obviously it'll throw an error or a IntelliSense error. So I need to cast that as an int because we know that's a whole number field. We can also return the padding. So I think I called that padding length. Let me just check. Yeah, padding length. And these will be these are all the logical names of the field, so they're all lowercase. Padding, that will be set. So we've now should have retrieved if they contain values. What I will do is initialize these with null so we can just check. We'll initialize these with 0. We know counter has to be populated. It's business required. We know the padding doesn't have to be. So we'll just default these to 0, and I'll set these to null as well. Okay, so now we need to build our reference. So now we need to build our reference. We could either use a string builder for this or just keep creating a new full reference. Obviously, because it's a immutable type, so if it'll have other strings in memory each time we write to another string concatenate. It does create another string in memory, but the garbage collector will clean that up. It's not particularly inefficient, but so what we can say is full reference, or rather, if prefix is not equal to null, or actually I'll do that a better way. If is string is null or empty, and then prefix, and we obviously want that to be if it's not null or empty. So that's the little exclamation mark beforehand. So that's basically saying, is it null or empty, true or false? But if it is null or empty, we'll get a true. We want the reverse of that, so we want the not, which is we could have said equals false. Then full reference equals full reference plus prefix is the first thing we wish to add. What we probably should have done here, actually, sorry, a bit messy, is set that to string.empty rather than null, because I think if it was null and we tried to concatenate to it, I think we'll probably get an exception, but I haven't tested that. So if it's just an empty string, it'll just build it on the fly. So we're going to have nothing here and add the prefix on. And then we can say, now we need to do if padding is greater than 0, and if it's greater than the actual length of the counter, because if we set the padding as 3 and the number was actually 1,000, already the number's longer than the padding. But this is the sort of logic you'd have to possibly build into I don't know where you'd build it, to be honest, but you might have to do workflows to notify somebody if the counter grows bigger than your padding, to send an email or something internally. But anyway, that's making it far more complex than it needs to be. So if padding is greater than 0 and padding is greater than counter dot toString, and then the length, so that'll give us the number of characters of length, then, and this is where we need to write some code to pad the value. So the counter padded needs to be set here. So now we need to create the counter padded string. So we know that our padding is greater than the length of the counter. So now we can, there is a toString format. So we can say our counter padded equals our counter dot toString, and then it's D and then the length. So that plus padding. So if we wanted to do 5 characters, we'd do D5 or D4 for 4 characters, and it would pad to that length. So if we add in our padding integer, so if it was, say, set to 5 in our instance, is the example I've done, it will pad it to 5 characters. So that will then create an in-memory counter padded. So if it was counter was currently at 0 or 1 or whatever, it would add on and pad with 4 zeros at the start. Otherwise, we can just say counter padded equals counter dot toString, which will just put the current counter into the counter padded, i.e. we don't want any padding because we didn't specify a value or it's already longer. So our padded string will become the actual counter, but we need to convert that to a string. I think it may do it if I may accept it. No, it doesn't like it if you don't cast it to a string or use the toString method. So this is a little bit messy with all these ifs, but we're going to iterate over. We've created these in-memory variables for the prefix, suffix, if it contains them, the counter, if it contains padding, and built this counter pad. Now we need to set the full reference. So full reference equals, sorry, I've missed one off. Okay, so now we need to do the suffix. So if not string.is null or empty, so if the suffix isn't null or empty, then full reference missed a step. Need to add the counter padded to the full reference. So full reference equals, or we can do plus equals, which will concatenate, plus the counter padded. And then if the suffix isn't null or empty, full reference plus equals suffix. So I hope that makes sense. So created the variables, read them into these in memory. So we've got strings and these variables in memory. done a check on whether the prefix is empty. If not, concatenate. I mean, I'll change, or I'll leave that as it is, both for valid, the shorthand or the full reference plus prefix. We've checked if the padding value has been set, and then if it's longer than the actual counter itself. If so, we formatted it, we padded the counter value, and then we concatenate in the padded value, so whether there was a prefix or not, we'll still end up with either just the padded counter or a prefixed version. And then we add the suffix in. And then the final step is to take the targeted field and add in the attribute. So now we need to set our entity field name, and obviously we need to get the field name from our current record. So I don't know why I keep typing Steve. So our field name attribute from our auto number entity, which field are we targeting? So it could be account number, etc. And target that, add that to the end, the attribute collection. But obviously this is going to return an object type, this bit here. So I just need to add a cast that, because we know the field name's a string. We might have to surround that in brackets. Equals our full reference. So what that's doing is taking our field name from our current auto number record, so which field we're targeting, cast it to a string and set our entity's attribute, add it to the collection and set the full reference to be that. And obviously this will do it for more than one auto number. So if we had another account targeting another, I don't know, account reference 2 with different settings or some other field, it will do all of those. And that's it. Once it completes that for each loop, adding these in, we don't need to do any updates or anything like that, because we're pre-operation in the pipeline stage. It will write this to the main record as part of the next stage. So as it passes this now from this portion of the pipeline through to stage 30, it will be committed with those new references. So that's our auto number plugin written, which I can now deploy and show you functioning. So to deploy, let's just check it builds first, F6, so build succeeded. To deploy to CRM, I'll just quickly show you that in the register file, it's added these extra bits of XML, which is telling it so because we created this plugin and we created the step, that's what it's added here, is this primary entity name account on a create message, the relevant inside transaction, pre-operation stage. What I need to do is right click and deploy. But what we'll need to do before then is sign our plugins assembly. So if I edit the properties of my plugins project and go to the signing, because you can't deploy any assemblies to CRM unless they're strongly signed. So tick sign the assembly, create a new key. I'm not going to password protect it. And then just plugin key or whatever you want, the name doesn't really matter. So that's now strongly signed. So if I save that and close that plugins property page. So now to deploy our plugin, I right click the package and deploy. And that has deploy succeeded. So if I bring up my solution file for CRM and shrink down entities, go to components, we can now see I've got this plugins assembly added. So click on plugin assemblies, we can see that it's registered in the sandbox. Obviously, if you're CRM online, you will have to register it in the sandbox. And then under message processing steps, we've got our new auto number create for our account. So now if I bring up CRM, so we've set a counter of, if I just put this as 100 or 126, just for the purpose of this demo. So now go to the sales area, my accounts, and create a new account. Hopefully the account number, let me just add it to the form before we create this new account. So account number, I'll just drop it under the account name, save, publish. Oops, sorry, this is just off screen. Save and publish. So I've added account number onto the form. We just go back to accounts, do a new. Account name. That's the only required field, I believe. Save. Our plugin should now load and fire. And as you can see, it's put in the reference. So it's took our prefix, our counter, and our suffix. One thing I've just realised I have missed off, obviously it's not incrementing the number and updating the entity. So I need to go back to our, so now if I was to do another account, it would actually have exactly the same reference. I'll show you, because I haven't actually set it to increment it and update the test account. And save, you'll see it's got exactly the same reference as the previous one, which is obviously not, kind of defeats the object of an auto number if it doesn't increment. So here, when we had finished obviously creating the reference, we'd need to add an additional step to take the underscore counter equals, we could just take the variable from memory, equals counter plus plus, and then service.update that entity. So this is the, as we're iterating over the results, any of the auto number records, as we iterate over them, creating the references and adding them to this current message entity, we can also update the auto number record and do a service.update. This is where I think there's more sophisticated solutions, because in probably 99% of situations, low volume creates, it would work perfectly, but the delay in reading the record in, doing this in memory, referencing and calculation of the reference, and subsequently updating, that could take, I don't know, it could be a couple of milliseconds, it could be seconds. In that time, if another instance of this plugin had been fired, or there's a multi-threaded data import or something, or you're in a massive call center with hundreds of employees and they're all entering or creating accounts or contacts, whatever the auto number is registered against, it's possible that you could be writing back and missing and lose values. So that's where I think there's better. I think Power Objects do one that uses an external web service to control that. But this will work in majority of situations if it's a small company or small medium company, but just something to be aware of. So yeah, that will now, if I right click that and deploy, I've deployed that, what I realise is I'll need to do the plus plus before the counter, because otherwise what that will do, the plus plus trailing the variable will increment it after it's done that. So after it's committed the value to this attribute in the auto number entity, it will increment it afterwards. So we need to increment it before it's actually written to this value, and then we write the update. We could have done the plus plus back up here wherever it gets referenced. So up in this section we could have done the counter plus plus here, but doesn't matter. Obviously, it's probably cleaner down here, so it's done at the end of when it's cleaning up and updating the object in CRM. So it'll increment it into this variable and then commit it to this. So let me just deploy that. Now if I go over to my CRM now, that's deployed, and create a new account. So test2, save. It'll load the new version, takes a second or so. So that's will have incremented it. But if I add another one now, test3, you should see that the code for updating the autonumber, see now it's 127 and so on. So if I keep adding them, obviously the autonumber is doing what it's supposed to do, which is incrementing it each time and writing it back. So if I go back to my setting auto numbers, you can see it's now incremented to 129. So the next one will be 129, and it will write back 130 and so on. So what I'll do, I'm going to end this video here because it's probably going to be over an hour. So this is part 1, and in part 2, we'll then write another plugin which will be registered against the autonumber entity, so that when a record is created, updated, or deleted, it will modify the message processing steps automatically for the autonumber. So thank you for watching this video. Any questions or comments or anything, post them below, and I'll see you in part 2.